Great. So first, thanks a lot for having me. So this is joint work with Ina, Ed, John, Rob, and Rafael. So a lot of coworkers here. And this is the first time that we present this paper outside of the Fed. So all feedback is very welcome. And also, as me, Ina, Ed, Rob, and me, we are at the Cleveland Fed. Of course, like the usual disclaimer applies. So yeah. So the main objective and the main question of this paper is to try to understand a little bit how is the relationship between inflation expectations and income growth expectations, and basically how they interact, and if there is another of causality in that side. So this question is relevant today, as we have seen that inflation has been rising, and we also see like tightened labor market. So there is a discussion about wage price spiral, and basically how this increase in inflation expectations could actually like translate into higher wages, and because of that also higher cost, and that got kind of like a feedback to inflation, and we can have like this type of spiral. But on the other side, also like actually from evidence usually before this last shock and when inflation was low, we saw that many private agents like consumers and firms, in the when we ask them basically about inflation, they usually talk that they dislike inflation. For example, Schiller, in a similar paper, basically he tried to survey a little bit why people basically dislike inflation, and basically and why consumers and like that. Kamdar, for example, in her NG Market paper, she basically modeled this behavior as that maybe people have a supply side shock, but also like Coibion and Candia usually have reported this kind of feature for consumers for a panel of countries with different surveys. And also we've seen something similar in the case of firms. The role of expectation have been discussed also lately. So actually there is a very provocative paper by Rob 2022 that said actually there is no role for inflation expectations. Actually, like at least there is not much evidence according to him. But actually, like we see like that many empirical work have shown that consumers are firm react. First, they react based to inflation information, and also they act accordingly, like with actions. Then, like, and this was probably like a question like before this one, that basically there was this idea that maybe, for example, at the zero lower bound, we could manage inflation expectation, and that can be used as a policy tool. But I was debating in Coibion et al. 2022. Basically, that depends a lot of how people perceive inflation. And actually, if people perceive it negatively, maybe the management of expectation, especially like, well, the main idea was to increase inflation expectation to decrease real rates and stimulate the economy. Well, that can be actually like can be affected if people perceive it as a supply shock, or actually like if they have like any other shock in mind. And actually, Brad, like in his paper, he also discussed that maybe one of the roles for inflation expectation could be through the labor market. First, like unfortunately, there is little evidence on the role of inflation expectation, the labor market decision, and here in this paper, we're going to try to inform to give some evidence on that side. But recent papers have shown, for example, that higher inflation is associated with an increase in job transition, and that basically, according to those authors, basically could be because actually when there is high inflation, real wages go down, and people are forced to look for employment. So then the question is basically there is a role for sticky nominal wages, and basically how households are finally going to perceive these increases in inflation or increasing inflation expectations, and are going to make decisions according to that. So basically in this paper, what we're going to do is that we're going to use a representative sample of the US population to first simultaneously measure both inflation expectations and income growth expectations. Actually, as I'm going to show you, first we did like a baseline exercise to see exactly how this could move, and then in the second part, we're going to implement a novel experimental setup to actually find the causal link, or like to estimate the causal link between them in both directions, because actually inflation expectation can cause a higher income growth expectation, nominal income growth expectation, and also like higher income growth expectation could affect inflation expectations. So that's something that we're going to try to do here. And then we incorporate this empirical finding in the new Keynesian model with nominal wage rigidity and search and matching frictions to actually assess the macro implications of our findings and understand the mechanism behind or one of the potential mechanisms that is behind why basically consumers might dislike inflation. You have any question? If not, I continue. The main empirical finding, first we find a causal but moderate relationship from inflation expectation to income growth expectations. So basically a 1% increase in inflation expectation resulting in a 0.2% increase in income growth expectation. So this is nominal income growth expectation. So at the end of the day, this would imply a decrease in real income or a perceived decrease in real income of 0.8%. We don't find a causal effect in the other direction, at least but it mainly, as I'm going to show you, is mainly coming from basically very high standard errors, not that much about a precise zero. Also, we find heterogeneous effect across socio-demographic factors such as income and gender. So actually, we find that an insignificant pass-through from women and low-income respondent, but actually a higher pass-through of high-income respondent and male respondents. And finally, we also try to have an idea of how inflation expectation affects some labor market actions. And then we find that basically a 1 percentage point increase in inflation expectation resulted only in 0.01 percentage point increase in the likelihood of applying to another job. And we actually also gather basically try to see what happened with other action, and we don't find any result in that sense.
Sorry, Mathieu.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, are these personal income expectations or aggregate income expectations?
Personal income expectations. So actually, so yes, so basically this is, we're gonna move the question, the relationship should be like from aggregate inflation, general prices, to their personal income, nominal income growth. Yeah. I'm gonna show you exactly basically each step of the experiment here.
So this is nominal income growth?
Nominal income growth. Yes.
So they expect the real income to decrease in 0.80 points?
Exactly, yes. So basically a 1% increase in inflation expectations only translating 0.2% increase in the nominal income growth. That means exactly what you said, a minus 0.8% inflation expectation. This is not coming from the data. We can debate a little bit basically, or discuss a little bit the relationship between this in the actual data. Of course, it's kind of hard because we have extensive and intensive margin and stuff like that. But when I show you a little bit the result, we can discuss a little bit the feature of the data. But all of this is expectations. We actually don't see what happened to the actual wages.
Matthew, a question here, Mariana from the bank. So I would like to know what you have in mind here. So I work, I eat, and I have inflation in my mind. I know that prices are going to go up, and then I'm going to go to my job and ask for an increase because prices are going to go up. That's the idea that you have here, like the mechanism behind this connection.
So first, the first objective is to try to see how is this relationship. And of course, like when we see higher inflation, it's hard to know if this is a supply shock, a demand shock, and exactly how people perceive this question. So the first objective of the paper is try to understand exactly basically what if there is a pass-through from this kind of like nominal variable that's inflation to income growth. Then we ask other questions, basically we call it action on the labor market or labor market actions, where we ask exactly like that. So basically we're going to ask them whether they're going to look for another job, whether they're going to work longer hours, or whether they're going to ask for a raise. And we actually find that higher inflation expectation does not increase, for example, asking for a raise question. Actually, the only labor action that is that seems to be associated with higher inflation expectations is actually like looking for another job. So part of the last part of the study, we're gonna try to understand a little bit more this mechanism again, mostly from the perception of consumers. When I want to say, like, it seems that like the bottom line would be that since that people at least perceive that their contracts are very inflexible, actually the only way that they perceive as a way to get out of basically actually to get away from inflation is to look for another job. And actually that's a little bit what we have seen in the public debate in the last month, that it seemed that job-to-job transition are kind of increasing, especially in this hot labor market.
So that's interesting, and I want to go a little further there, because one of the things that we, as emerging markets or as an economy that used to live with very high inflation that we still have in place is indexation, right? So here in Chile, we have a lot of contracts, like rent, like apartment renting, or also our contracts, our work contracts that include an indexation clause. I don't know how you say that in English. But in the US and in other developed economies, I don't think that is a common practice. So probably one of the things that is very interesting from here is that you're not going to find, so that what you would find here is very different from what you're going to find probably in the US.
Yes, I agree with that. So basically, that's a very interesting point, because so the context of the US is actually an economy that was having like very low inflation for a long period of time. So basically all the big topic in the 2010s was basically why inflation is so low and what we can do to increase a little bit more of inflation. So the respondents that are answering this question, basically they see a small, basically this was in February, so inflation was relatively high. It wasn't the media and all of that, but most of these consumers basically did not have an experience of inflation. And of course, like if inflation remains high, probably we're gonna start seeing some like kind of institutional or like private institutional basically reforms that are gonna probably produce some type of indexation to protect different type of people. So I agree with you. In the US, there is not the UEF or anything like that. So actually, like it's a very non-index economy. If we ask the same question in Argentina or in like in country with higher inflation, probably we're gonna find something different. And actually, that's related when we look at, for example, at survey of inflation expectations. In general, like kind of like older people in the US that basically live the 70s and 80s, basically with the experience of high inflation in the US, actually tend to have higher inflation expectation and tend to react strongly to this type of shocks. We have some also like age difference here. I don't remember if we find something related to the labor market, but that also is something like kind of that. The point is that I think that the experience of inflation, not only like institutional, but actually how inflation is treated like in the different contexts, is something that can affect this result for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the main takeaway from the model application is that basically subject to inflationary shock, consumer are going to drop, consumer utilities are going to drop. Because of the friction of the model, they're going to work longer hours at a low real wage. A higher like wage rate is going to amplify the output and consumption fluctuations. So the main idea is that basically consumers are going to have a very rigid contract, and they're basically going to adjust other margins to actually compensate for that. And then like also we find like very little macroeconomic effects from the pass-through of inflation expectation into labor market actions. And that's something that actually is also potentially interesting. That means that actually like this external option that consumer would have, it seems that it's not going to have a lot of macroeconomic effect, at least in the context of this model. So just to give you an overview of basically of the experimental setup. So first, we start asking about inflation expectation and income growth expectation. So this comes from a survey that we have been running that I'm going to show you in a little bit with Morning Consulting and the Cleveland Fed. So first, we started with a kind of baseline application in January 2020, where basically we ask in a given week 20,000 respondents basically both their inflation expectation and their income growth expectations for the next year. Then in February 2020, when we learned a little bit about this, basically we made like this experiment for 6,700 respondents, where basically we introduced that treatments. So basically we're going to have 5 information treatment group that I'm going to explain you a little bit the logic now, and then also like a control group. Then basically we asked so in February we asked also like the post-treatment questions. So basically kind of the posteriors of inflation expectations and income growth expectation. They are not exactly the same question. I'm going to show you in detail the question, but and the main idea why we don't ask exactly the same question is because when people, it seems that from other experience, when people are asked like many times the same question, they think that actually we are playing with them. So actually we change a little bit the question to have a little bit the same the same information, and then we ask them about the labor market actions. So the prior question, and this is what we have been calling the indirect consumer inflation expectation question. So this is a survey that we have been running with Morning Consult and the Cleveland Fed. We have a paper that was released early this year, basically where we explain a little bit the methodology and what is behind this. But the main idea is it's kind of like it's an indirect utility approach to estimate inflation expectation. I'm gonna show you the question in one question. This survey is weekly, so basically every week we survey 20,000 respondents, and we actually publish this information every week as well. So the question is a little bit complicated, but again, like the main idea is to ask kind of like this kind of indirect utility approach. And actually, so far we find like a kind of very interesting and meaningful results. So the bottom line is basically ask, given your expectation about the development of prices and goods during the next 12 months, how would your income have to change to make you equally well off relative to the current situation, such that you can buy the same amount of goods and services as today? So basically, it had this kind of income approach of again, like indirect utility approach to try to see what is the inflation expectation that they expect. This is an individual inflation expectation in a way. It's not like an aggregate inflation expectations. So that has some good things. So first, for example, if you look at the Michigan survey of inflation expectation and the New York survey of inflation expectation, they usually ask about general prices or CPI inflation, stuff like that. So it has, that has kind of the good side, that is kind of like it's something that everybody should answer the same answer, but also like maybe those prices are not the one that affect me as a consumer. So it sounds sometimes more as a test that actually like basically what are the inflation that expected. And then we give them a numerical anchor here. We have tested different numerical anchors throughout the survey before, and we don't find the significant effects of these numerical anchors. That's something that is different from our question. And then we ask them basically whether basically they're going to increase, stay the same, or decrease. And then basically they have to put a numerical point if it is increased or decreased. This is how the survey looked like since February 2020. So again, like we have been surveyed this like every week. This correlated like very highly with CPI inflation, where CPI inflation now is a little bit higher than this. So some expectations are relatively low. So basically, what happened here, like expectations were a little bit higher than CPI at the beginning of the year, then inflation starting to increase, and now we hear higher inflation expectations. The advantage of this measure is that this is weekly. It has some weekly noise, but it's actually like we have a higher frequency than others. Survey at Michigan, New York that actually have weekly, so monthly information, and also we have a huge sample. So every week we answer like 20,000 consumers. And then basically this again, like the prior question, we ask about their income, and this is a way simpler question. We ask them, do you expect your income to increase, decrease, or stay about the same over the next 12 months? And again, they have the same options and they can answer exactly the same. So from the baseline exercise that we did in January 2020, this is a little bit like the correlation between these two variables. So first, as you can see, nominal wage expectations are way lower than inflation expectations. So when we ask people about inflation expectation, and this is common like in many surveys, there are many people that answer like very high numbers. But when we ask basically for nominal wage expectation, these numbers are way down. So actually, like there is a very low correlation between both. And we can see a little bit like the summary statistics. You can see that actually like the average inflation expectation is way higher than the nominal income growth. And this implies, for example, for this particular sample with this particular criminal data that we did, that actually people expect a real income growth of -7% in this. Well, that was what people were expecting at the time. And we did this basically with the 20,000 observations. And also basically these two measures are highly correlated, but with a relatively small slope. Do you have any question? Right. So then basically we move to the information treatment. So we randomly assign at this so we registered this RCT, and we randomly assign 5 information treatments and 1 control group. So first we have a control group with around like 1,000 variables. Then we treat people, a subgroup of people, so a little bit more than 1,000, we basically give them the target of the Fed. So we told them the Federal Reserve, so after the two prior question, we give them the information and then they have to answer the posterior. So basically this one is, the first reverse target is 2% per year in the long run. Then to another group, we give them this information about wage inflation expectations, in a way, but aggregate wage inflation expectations. So at the time, basically, we said that a recent survey from the conference board found that wages were expected to rise 3.9% in 2020. Then to a third group, we give them like the past inflation expected, past inflation. So basically between January 2021 and January 2022, the CPI inflation grew like 7.5%. Yes.
Sorry, something I got lost a little bit. So you do this weekly, but then you did this treatment. So how does it work? Did you do the treatment only once, or you do the treatment every time, or?
No, sorry. So I was not clear about that. So yes, so this survey we do it like every week. So every week we basically have a new measure inflation expectation. The particular exercise, we did it all at the same week. I don't remember exactly which week was in February, but one week in February, we said, okay, we're gonna make this experiment with this prior, treatment, and posterior. And then basically after that, we stop asking the same question and we stop giving treatment to consumers. So yeah, so this is just like in 1 week of February 2022. Yeah. So basically to another group, we give them basically the survey of professional forecaster, forecast of inflation for 2022. And finally, to the last group, we give them like what we call a placebo here. So basically, we just give them information that should not be too relevant for forming expectations. And in this case, we just gave them like the population of the U.S. Economy according to the census of the U.S. in 2021. And then we move to the posterior question. So for the posterior question, actually the first one, we ask them like a question about inflation that is relatively similar to the Michigan Survey of Consumers. So basically, it's in the next year, do you think that prices in general will increase, decrease, or stay the same, and by what percent? And then like we have a posterior of income, exactly the same question, but we move a little bit the time frame with an overlap. So we say between December 2022 and December 2023, do you expect that your income is going to increase, that stay the same? And finally, we ask them about labor market actions. So basically, first, so after this question, we give them 4 options. Actually, they have to answer the 4 options. And the first one is basically the question again is how likely are you to do the following to increase your income over the next 3 months? First, apply for a job that pays more. Second, work longer hours. And third, ask for a raise. And for each of these questions, they can ask very unlikely, somewhat unlikely, somewhat likely, and very unlikely. And also they can ask, I don't know. Very few people ask, actually, I don't know. They were very opinionated. And then basically we also give them like another option where we can put like a kind of a free question. And basically looking at that, actually from the 6,000, we have something like 700 people that answered this question, and most of them were related to stuff like investing in crypto, for example, stuff like that. Working a second job were also like kind of very common in that case. That is kind of similar to longer hours, but I guess they're a little bit different. But there were like very few people that asked this question. And again, like they also asked these other questions, so they're not like kind of exclusive in that sense. So this is the structure of the experiment. So first, prior question about inflation. Second, prior inflation question about wages or income. Third, information treatment. Fourth, posterior about inflation. 5, posterior about income. And finally, labor market action. So that's kind of the structure that we have. Do you have any question before I move to the results?
Matthew?
Yes.
Hi, Gonzalo Garcia Trujillo from the bank here. So I was wondering, because I think there are several things that are happening in this time, right? We have the Great Resignation. We have a huge surge in the new business applications. So, for instance, and also we know that wage growth is mainly driven by job-to-job transitions, right? so if you see that there is a lot of new, still we don't have the data, the administrative data for new business creation, but we have some expectations that we are seeing more employer businesses that are being created now in this time. So that is like I don't know, like a leading indicator for the workers that they can apply to new jobs because there is like these new opportunities in the market, right? And also we are seeing now an unprecedented high level of churn at the labor market. Which some people think is because of this new search in employer business creation. So I don't know how you can disentangle those features from what an individual would decide because of the increase in inflation expectations for the future, and using this job-to-job transition as a mechanism to deal with that increase in the inflation expectations.
Yeah. So first, like the structure is the following. So there is different group of people that receive different information treatment. So all the things that you were saying like are common to all this group of people. So basically for the control and different treatment. So what we're gonna do later, and I'm gonna show you basically the specification in a second, we're gonna compare people that receive the information treatment with the control group and with the placebo group. So basically first we're gonna find that the placebo doesn't have produced an effect on the procedure about inflation expectations. And then basically we have these two. So of course, like higher labor opportunities and all of that are gonna be common for all these groups. So when we see that actually like inflation expectation increase, for example, the probability of finding another to apply to another job is gonna be relative to the control group. So the relative to that particular level. Of course, like basically the context also can make kind of like some effect about so can produce an effect on the interaction. So maybe new jobs times inflation create kind of like a kind of like a higher a higher effect than in normal times. So of course, like this is an experiment, it's an RCT and all those type of things. So we have the problem of external validity and all those type of things. So that's why basically we are super clear about when we run this effect, and actually when we calibrate the model, we're gonna use the information of that period of time to calibrate the model. We can discuss how much this apply before and after. And actually, I think that this is kind of like related with the question that Mariana had before. So basically, of course, if we run the same equation in a completely different context where inflation has been high since forever, maybe we're gonna find something different. But the main idea here is that all those kind of common features of the economy are gonna also be in the control group. So when we present the result here, are gonna be the treated versus the control group, not the treated by itself.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question? So okay, first I'm gonna try to show you a little bit how these measures kind of relate. And actually, this experiment in particular was a little bit useful for us as well because it's a way to show how our measure correlates with measure of aggregate inflation expectation, as for example the Michigan survey. So I'm gonna show you first kind of like the correlation between this variable and also between the posteriors. So here I want you to focus first, like kind of this is the raw correlation. So all the data here we're gonna Winsorize it like 2.5% each side. But for those of you that kind of are familiar with this type of surveys, here kind of sometimes outliers tend to lead a lot these results. So we also run a kind of like a Uber regression. And actually, I don't have it here, but also we run like kind of median regression, and we find very similar result of Uber regression. So what Uber regression does is kind of like try to put more weights in the middle of the sample instead of the outliers. So we find first a very like significant and positive correlation between the consumer inflation expectations and the actual posterior. So the prior and the posterior, of course, like for all and from the control. When we run like Uber regressions for the control group, this is actually 0.5, it's relatively high. And when we look at the income, also we find like a very high correlation. So we don't run Uber regression, and this is something that's going to be common for the next one for the income group because there is actually there is very little effect on the. In many cases, there is very little changes between the prior and the posterior. So basically, when we tend to move to the median of the distribution, actually we find a bunch of zeros. So that's why over regression doesn't work for this kind of when we correlate these two regressions alone. Then when we run with other controls, that's going to be solved. So then basically the next step is to see whether the treatment affects or not people expectations. So what we're going to run here is the following regression. So we have the posterior, for example, of prices. We're going to basically have first kind of like the prior of inflation. So this is only going to be basically this beta is going to tell us what is the correlation for the control groups, exactly the same coefficient that we saw before. And then we're going to have two types of interaction. First, a level, basically, kind of a different intercept for each treatment. And then we're going to interact the inflation expectation, the prior inflation expectation with the treatment to see exactly how much basically the treatment affects the prior. So the main idea here is that, so usually we need like a high correlation between posterior and prior. And then what it should happen is that the treatment should make that, well, people treatment like put less weight on their priors. So this coefficient here should be negative if basically this is the case that the treatment affect less the posterior group. So that's what we are looking at. And again, like it makes sense because it means that actually, yeah, like basically people treated are gonna put more weight on the information of the treatment and not that much weight on the prior. Why we don't just run kind of the difference between these two? Because it could happen that we're just kind of hitting the mean of the distribution, and so in that case we're not going to find any effect. So that's why it's actually important to control for where in the distribution are the different consumers, and then like basically estimate it in this way. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for the income question. Again, like to have an idea of how the treatment affects these different questions. So I want you to focus first on this column here. That is what we do. So first we run OLS. We don't find a lot of significant result because of the reason that I explained before. When we run Uber or median regression, quantile regression in median, like actually we find very similar results. And what we find first, okay, this is the same correlation that I showed you before for the control group. So this is the correlation for the control. What we find is first, like the target prior. So this question about the target of the Fed, move their priors, but just a little bit. So this result is significant, but actually, like when we compare the correlation, like basically they don't put that much weight on this one. Then we find that the wage, CPI, and SPF priors, so all the information about expected wages, past inflation, and expected inflation, actually basically produce like a strong change of the price. So actually, people put half the weight of their on the price compared with the posteriors in this case. And when we look at the placebo, and this is also something reassuring, basically we find that the placebo has no effect on actually the priors of the people, and that's actually, well, we design in this way, but it's not necessarily like it's not necessarily something that we should expect, and actually that happened. And also this is important because it might be that just people change because they receive some type of information. So it might be just I receive a number, I change it because of the number. This is showing that actually like that's not the case. When we look at the income regression, actually we find very small effect of the information. Actually, the only one that has some significant effect but very little is the wage inflation, is the wage information treatment, and this is mainly suggests that actually people might be more certain about their income, and actually aggregate variables are not affecting how people perceive their income expectation. So then basically we turn to estimate. You have any question about that before? So then we turn basically to estimate the pass-through of inflation expectation to income growth expectation. So how are we gonna do that? First, we're gonna regress the income in the posterior of the income on the price on the posterior of the inflation, and we're gonna control by the previous level. And then, as basically the whole point of this exercise that these two variables are endogenous. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna instrument this variable with the information treatment that we give them. So what we're gonna have here is that we're gonna take treatment 2, 4, and 5. So basically all but the wage treatment, and we're gonna do an IV where we put actually like kind of the change that was produced by the treatment on the priors. And we're gonna, with that, basically instrument the posterior of prices. And this is gonna be 0 for the control group and for the placebo group. And we're gonna exclude basically what happened with, we're gonna exclude from this regression people treated with the wage income. With the wage treatment, sorry. And again, like we didn't invent this. This had been used in, for example, Cobion et al. 2022 in the AGA macro paper. Something very similar is in the QA paper for the firms in Italy of Cobion and Goranichenko and Ropella. And then we're gonna do the same thing for the, well, from income to prices, but we only gonna include basically the people treated by the wage treatment. And we don't include this one here because actually here we are treating wages. So this is kind of like the main table of the paper. So as you can see, basically we find an OLS that is really small, basically the correlation between these two, between prices and inflation to income. When we do the IV, we have a very good IV, basically a very good F test. And actually we find that this correlation is 0.2%. So again, that means that 1 percentage point increase in inflation expectations increases income growth expectations in 0.2%. And again, like the variation here is coming by basically the treatment that we give them, not because of basically of the raw correlation. When we do the same thing with prices, actually we find a very high coefficient first with the OLS, but when we actually use the information that we give them, we find a very, very low correlation. And this is something important that I want to highlight. This is not a 0, it's a relatively high coefficient, but with huge standard errors. So actually here, like instead of saying there is no correlation, actually we cannot say that much about how personal income growth translate to aggregate inflation. And again, basically we have also a high F test. Have any question? So then we move to different demographics. So in the question we have different demographics. So basically we estimate exactly the same regression, but for different levels of for each of the different demographics. So first, so this
sorry, can I ask you a question? Sorry, I'm Alvaro from the bank. So the table that you showed before, I think it says that no, the other one, the one on the how the priors affect your yes. So this means that people know their income very well, at least taking into account the information that you are giving them, but they don't know very well the inflation rate, right? It may be the case that I know my nominal wage, but I don't know the real wage because I don't know the inflation. I'm very sure about my nominal wage, but I don't know anything about the real wage. And it's not that you change inflation and I will change my estimation of my nominal wage. I will change my estimation of my real wage. And you don't see that in the regression, right? So maybe it's not that there is an increase in inflation, and then I realize that I will be poor, that my nominal wage will not respond to that. You see, but I know that the nominal wage is responding to inflation and to my productivity, but I don't know the rate of inflation. So you change inflation, and I realize that I'm poorer, right? But it's not that I'm not. I don't think that my nominal wage will not reflect inflation.
Well, but so okay, so basically what you're saying is that people perceive, like they know for basically almost certainty the income system. So one caveat on that I agree with you. I agree with you, but here is just condition on the treatment that we give. Maybe we just gave them like very poor treatments about basically what they
sure. Yes.
Their income.
Yeah.
So basically, people don't know that much, with very certainty about the nominal income and the inflation, and the inflation they don't know that much. Then they receive information about inflation, they change the inflation expectation, they perceive that the real income actually, they realize that the real income is lower. So then that would suggest in a way that actually I expect that by December 2023, inflation is not going to affect my nominal wages. We tend to think that people negotiate in real terms. So that means if something that, at least my interpretation might be wrong, I know what you think, is that people, that is kind of like a measure of kind of very rigid labor contracts. Because if I suddenly if I expect a real rate of, I don't know, 5%, and then I realize that inflation is 5, I realize that actually my real income increase is going to be 0. Well, in the canonical New Keynesian model, I should be able to go to my employer and tell him, actually, look, like I negotiate in real terms, like I want to renegotiate, and everybody should be fine. This suggests that at least like labor contract seems to be a big friction, at least how people perceive their income, because they don't think that actually their contract could change over time.
But you're showing already that so these guys don't know inflation very well, right? Because you gave them treatment, exactly, and they accepted expectations. So they are negotiating with an expectation that is not it's not very.
No, of course, I agree. So, the question is why they think that when they actually know better inflation, why do they think that they cannot renegotiate their contracts? And if that's the case, that means that actually we have like very rigid contract. That actually that's a little bit how we're gonna try to model it. But also that means that actually, for example, like we have all this discussion about the redistribution channel between lenders and borrowers, because actually in our canonical models, the rates, the nominal rates kind of is fixed, no? Well, this means that actually we also would have something similar in terms of the labor markets, and maybe we should pay more attention to that. But what basically this seems to suggest is that like if people realize they're going to be higher inflation, they already negotiated their nominal salaries, and that means they're going to perceive that inflation as a decrease in the nominal in the real income. I think it's exactly basically what we're trying, what we show with this exercise. Or we intend to show what we found with this exercise. Something different would be like if people, well, if the pass-through is 1, then people would basically would realize that it's going to be higher inflation. They go to their employers and they renegotiate accordingly. But that seems that is not something that happened, and we're going to try to explore that with the labor market actions. So, in terms of the demographic, and actually this is something interesting. So yes.
Can I ask a question? It's just a clarification question.
Of course.
Could you come back to the previous slide, the one that you have been discussing with Álvaro? Is this one? You have a table where you show us how the treatment actually affects this one. I think this one. This is actually like the first stage regression of your next slide.
Yes, kind of, yes. It's just that basically for the price regression, we drop this kind of like this all the people that were treated by the wage information. But yeah, so basically we use these coefficients. So what we do is basically we take these coefficients and we take the priors, and with that basically we create this instrument that is also like, it also considers basically this is the gamma, this is the kind of like how their intercept changes. So basically the main idea here is that, so imagine that you have like a positive correlation here, I cannot write basically between these two, and then what happens if people treat it basically, and if here you have posterior or not, like it turns like the slope down, so that's why you should also expect a decrease in the information. But yeah, so basically, and we're giving 0 to the control and to the placebo, so that means that we are taking only the people that changed, only the information that is coming from the change in the posterior given to the treatment.
Okay, and in your second step, there is a regression where the posterior income is actually the explanatory variable? Or?
Yeah, so basically
sorry, can you go back one slide?
Yep.
There is like in the second, your question 5, no? So exactly. Trying to see the effect of income on prices. Just my curiosity is that it seems that you don't have relevance for this posterior income, no? Because it seems that the treatment is not changing your posterior on income, your income posterior.
Exactly. So that's on the right. So basically, this trend is very weak in changing the posterior. So that might explain why the result we don't find those results. So that's why I wanted to highlight that this is not that we're finding a zero. We have huge standard errors. It might come from the weak instrument, basically an instrument that is not as good to change posteriors, and that maybe that's why we don't find a feedback from income expectation to general prices. So that's why basically I wanted to highlight that again. Like, this is not a zero; it's a high coefficient, but with huge standard errors.
Okay, it's like you don't have relevance. Thanks.
Yeah. So that's why now we're gonna focus more on the price to income than the other one. So,
Matthew, can I ask you something about your interpretation of this coefficient? So, since this is through expectations, I'm wondering if the data holds on actual wages and CPI, etc. Because what I'm thinking is maybe households are very cautious in assuming whether their nominal income will grow or not, and they're assuming kind of a worst case scenario that it's going to grow 20% of the increase in inflation. But maybe that's not what actually happens, right? Maybe it grows a lot more. Maybe it's just them being cautious, since you're looking at this through expectations, you don't know that, right?
Exactly. So here we don't have the actual income. The objective of the exercise is try to understand why people perceive inflation as costly. Then, of course, like maybe the labor action happens something similar. Maybe after something different happened. When we look at the administrative data for the US, something like 35% of people don't receive any nominal adjustment or didn't receive any nominal adjustment on their incomes, at least for the period, I think it's 2013, 2014, something like that. So that means that in an environment of low inflation, but still positive, people don't receive any nominal adjustment. So 35% of people don't receive any nominal adjustment. Maybe people are exaggerating this, so maybe there's 1 year that happened, another year that doesn't happen, and well, yes. So this doesn't mean that that actually this is what's going to happen in the future, but at least it gives us an idea of how people perceive this high inflation. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Question? So when we move to the different demographic characteristics, here basically again, like we run exactly same regression, but for different group of people. So first we run by gender, and what we find is that actually male respondents have a higher perceived pass-through than the average, and of course that basically the implication of that is that female respondents actually have a lower pass-through for inflation expectation, and actually like this is not statistically significant. Some are not that big, but actually like the coefficient is lower. And when we look at different level of income, actually we find that actually like higher income people perceive a higher pass-through for inflation expectation to income compared to middle income, and of course like lower income respondents. So actually this again, like we don't have a lot more information about them, but suggest that actually groups that are perceived at least to have like higher bargaining power actually seems to have higher perceived pass-through compared to others. And then basically we look at the labor market actions. So again, like remember, we have 3 labor market actions here. First, like how likely they are to apply to another job, how likely they are to work longer hours, or how likely they are to ask for a raise. And again, like basically here, what we do, basically we regress this on the posterior, and for some of them, we're gonna instrument the posterior in the same way that we did it before. So when we look to apply for another job, we find like a positive correlation, but actually goes higher when we see we instrument this variable. As basically this coefficient is kind of hard to measure. It's a number that goes from 1 to 4. We take kind of the elasticity, a 1% increase in inflation expectation, how much applied to another job increase in terms of percent when there is an increase in a percentage increase in the inflation expectation. We find an elasticity of 0.1%. When we look at work for longer hours, actually we find a very small correlation. When we use the IV, actually the coefficient is 0. And when we ask for a raise, that actually this I think is something that Alvaro was suggesting, that basically if I know basically more about inflation now, maybe I should be able to renegotiate my real income. we find no effect. And actually, this coefficient is truly like very small and not significant because of that. So actually, you can see basically we find same standard errors, it's just that this coefficient is very, very small, and we don't find any effect on us again, like as for arrays or world long care hours when we use the IB exercise.
Hey,
yes?
I have a question as well.
Yes.
I think somebody else was gonna ask.
No, go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah. Okay. So I was wondering whether this would happen even like in a different experiment. You know, like people just say that they're gonna apply for another job, like automatically. You know, instead of because of something or because of the environment. Because so, are you able to control for that, or so did you also have like a placebo here that you can compare?
So here in the control group, we add the placebo group, but the placebo group is the one that receives information about the US population. So it seems that at least from this point of view, like this is not coming from just receiving some type of information. Now, yeah, we have to be, yes, so of course, like with these macro variables, it's kind of hard to know exactly what causes what. So that's why we selected just information treatment related to prices. We could maybe do something similar with the wage treatment and see if we find something.
Just because like if I'm a person that somebody's telling me that something bad is happening, the inflation is gonna high, I'm gonna need more money, and I don't seem plausible to ask for a raise, and I don't seem plausible to work for longer hours, then the only answer that I would give is to apply for another job. Is that?
Yeah, but that's exactly fine. So it seems that people don't seem as plausible as for a raise. And that basically, if we are, again, like if we negotiate in real terms, that should be actually the one of the actions that I should consider. But it seems that at least from this sample of people in this exercise, when they have an increase in inflation expectation, that another thing, like inflation expectation, now we know that basically something negative. But for example, in the US, if I am a borrower, higher inflation expectation should benefit me, and that's all the Auclair basically idea. And here at least we see that on average, people don't perceive that this that's the case. So it seems.
I understand, but my concern is that what if you do exactly the same thing, but say that there's going to be deflation? Like put in another, everything is the same. Yes, there's deflation instead of high inflation, and you ask the same questions and everything. My concern is that maybe the answer is going to be the same.
But
automatically they're just going to say, I'm going to apply for another job because I think there's a problem. I don't know what the problem is, but so that's the only solution I have. So that's what I'm going to do.
Just to clarify, like I didn't give, so actually most of the information treatment that we gave are lower than the average of the inflation expectation of people. So actually for most of the people here, this is a deflationary treatment. Especially, for example, the one of the 2%, for example, the one of the SPF, it was 3.9. Now we know that probably that's, I should not say that, but that probably is not going to be the case. But my point is that, yeah, so this is like a linear projection. So maybe here there is some nonlinearity. Actually, I haven't explored that people like that move from up and down, like they go in the same direction. But this is like, yeah, this is a linear projection. So that is the same for people that adjust downward or people that adjust upward. And yeah, like and in this case of this particular sample, for most of the people, the adjustment not necessarily goes to lower inflation. Usually move toward the treatment that for most of the people that move them, or not necessarily most of the people, yeah, but no, not for most of the people, but for many people, it moved to the, because that most of the people would be the median, but at least on average, it moved them downward. Yeah. So
did you also have the option not to do anything?
Well, that would be very unlikely. So we asked them to answer between very unlikely to very likely. So yeah, very unlikely would be nothing. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Gonzalo?
Matthew, I was wondering if in the action applied to other job, does that option imply that you have to quit to your current job, or you could also just apply for an additional job and keep your main job that you had before.
So the question is not, the question is a little bit, doesn't open for that option. And that's why I was telling before, like when we look at the others answer, many of those other, even if there were like few people that answered that question, many of those were actually from the 700, let's say like 100 of them that answered that question, 100 of them, or no, probably less, but something like that, were actually saying that they were looking for a second job. So a second job here is between apply for another job or work longer hours. That may be something that in the design we didn't think that much about it. So here apply to another job is just to apply to another job. Doesn't matter if it's a second job or a different job.
Yeah. And for instance, if you want to open a business, like a non-employer business, that would be accounted in this concept, or it wouldn't?
My interpretation would be like not apply to another job, maybe not, but yes. So yeah, we don't have that option. Again, in others, there were very few people that said something about starting my own business. So yeah, I'm not sure about that where it would be considered. I'm not sure either, like how many entrepreneurs we had in the sample. We would need like probably like a big number of entrepreneurs or people like with likely to start like a business to actually move this significantly. But that's something that we could have asked and we didn't ask.
Yeah, because I was thinking the same mechanism that you are thinking for the labor market maybe can be applied to the decision to start a business, right? We saw a surge in the non-employer business creation, as we also saw it for employer business creation, but the non-employer dimension was higher. This jump was more important for the non-employer. So maybe also could be some explanatory power from this channel to that feater.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. I don't know. Actually, I don't know like any paper, but maybe I don't know that I don't know everything. I don't know all of them, but I have not seen like any work on basically related inflation with entrepreneurial kind of decisions. So that could be something that a margin that could be interesting here. Again, like in the others, that other question, we find some answers like related to that. So that's something that actually maybe there is a space to explore there, because I get that there you move to a job that is you have flexible real wages at least.
Yeah, exactly, because you get the ability to decide prices or wages if you are the owner of a business, thing that you can't do when you are a worker and you expect very rigid contract wages. So yeah.
Yeah, no, but yeah, you're right. I think that would be an interesting margin. We don't have it here, but something that we could definitely like explore with this type of setting.
Great.
So yeah, just to kind of like summarize here, basically we find like three basically empirical facts. So first is the empirical findings. First is the less than unit pass-through of inflation expectation to income growth. That's 0.2 percentage points. Second is the basically the pass-through increases with consumers' current income, and we find that basically higher income respondents actually have a way higher pass-through. And finally, that higher inflation expectation results in very mild changes in the labor market action. So 1 percentage point 1% increase in inflation expectation increases the likelihood to apply to another job in 0.11%. And again, like this kind of like at least from our view, like this seems to suggest like very rigid like labor market contracts. So basically now we're gonna try to basically to add this kind of type of finding in a new Keynesian model. So basically we have a new Keynesian model with search and matching frictions. So we're gonna have a representative household that maximizes utility and has a riskless bond. So it's gonna, of course, like the usual utility function, so increasing consumption, decreasing labor hours, labor hours, this utility is going to enter in the wage bargaining, and we're going to model this as a right to manage framework. So basically, they negotiate the wages, and then like the owner of the firm can kind of negotiate the labor hours, can decide the labor hours, and the household is going to supply them as demanded. So in this framework, we have three types of firms. So the first one is a labor good firms that basically negotiate at a search and matching level as a la pizzerías and mortgages and pizzerías, face fixed costs, and then sells its product to another firm that has monopolistic competition and set prices a la calvo, and then basically they sell this monopolistic competition prices to a retailer that actually takes all this kind of differentiated good and creates a bundle good that sells in a perfect competitive market. So actually we're gonna have profits in this one and this one, in the first firm and the second firm. We have monetary policy that respond to inflation deviation from the target and output growth, and we have an exogenous government spending. Just to show a little bit, like this is basically the value of an employed worker. So you can see basically this first, the utility function, there is this probability of basically going to unemployment. And this basically is the key friction that we're gonna add here. Yeah. Yeah. So basically this is the key friction. So in the next period, depending on how basically if you remain employer, with the probability gamma is gonna stay with the same wage that is gonna be partially adjusted by inflation. So this pi bar is 1. And we're gonna add this. I'm gonna explain you like in a second, this kind of like this is the wage push factor that is gonna come from this possibility of applying for another job. And then with a probability 1 minus gamma, actually they're going to be able to renegotiate the salary, and they're going to renegotiate it depending on however is the nature of the shock. And of course, like basically in the unemployment value, we have something very similar. So the first, we're going to try to match the fact 1. So basically we have nominal wage rigidity, and basically we're going to calibrate that through basically this gamma parameter. And we're gonna find basically with log linearize the solution, and we're gonna calibrate basically. We find that they actually like the change in expected inflation, expected wages, income, or expected inflation. And here basically in this case, we have rational expectations. So basically everything is forward looking. So this is just gonna be the realized one. Gonna depend on basically of all this basically of these elasticities that are basically some kind of a nonlinear function that depend of gamma. And actually with this, we can calibrate the value of gamma, and we find a gamma of 0.47 that is going to be the pass-through, the one that is going to match the pass-through that we find in the data. And then we're going to have a contrafactal with a gamma a little bit lower that is going to be a gamma when we have like a unit pass-through. Then basically we're going to also kind of try to match basically the fact number 3. And here what we're going to do is that we're going to suppose that worker cannot, in the case that they cannot renegotiate, they can basically receive kind of like an outside offer with certainty that that's gonna push basically the nominal wages. So what we're gonna have is basically this is the log linear change in wages depend on basically on the actual indexation that we have in the economy, plus basically this new factor that is what we call the wage push factor. And the wage push factor is going to be persistent, and it's going to depend on this elasticity and the expected inflation. And basically, this is going to be the pass-through times the elasticity of job application with respect to inflation expectation. That is the one that we found in the last part of the empirical part. And again, like these are going to be the values for the different applications. So the first thing that we find with this exercise is actually when we look about what happened the log linearized utility of consumer, we find that actually with lower pass-through, in the case of a demand shock, utility is going to be lower. So people are going to dislike having like kind of this rigid. So first, like inflationary shocks are gonna negatively affect their utility, and actually they're going to dislike more when there is a higher pass-through. And why this is coming from this fact that actually real wages are not going to adjust that much. Actually, they're going to have it's going to be a little bit of persistency because of this pass-through, and people are going to force to actually like to work longer hours. It's going to have like amplification in terms of output and hours, and that's going to translate in lower utility. And we find something similar when we find like a supply shock. So real wages are not going to move that much, and that basically is going to reduce kind of the utility of workers as well when we have higher inflation. And finally, basically, we run contrafactuals. I'm about to get out of time, so I'm running contrafactuals with basically the wage push factor or not, and we find that actually, given the magnitudes that we find in the empirical part, this should not translate in significantly kind of changes in macroeconomic variables from our perspective, and actually something that we can discuss later. If you have any question?
You still have like 10 minutes, so or a little more. So.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
but I'm about to conclude. I thought basically the last 15 minutes were about for general discussion, but yes. So just but yes. So basically that actually like most of the paper. So just to summarize, basically we find that first, like the main idea here is try to understand how people perceive inflation in terms of the labor market action. So first, system of the real income, and secondly, related to other outcomes. And what we find is kind of a very low pass-through from inflation expectation to income growth expectations. This idea, of course, like it's not new. Chile in 1997, like a little bit discussed this idea. The main kind of addition of this paper is try to put it in a framework with kind of like in a way like a exogenous variation in inflation expectations, and actually see how that correlates. And I think that part of the discussion that we had at the end with the model is kind of course, like it's very hard to understand how people perceive the nature of an inflationary shock. So actually, like, this kind of can link a little bit on average and how people perceive that. We find heterogeneous effect across demographics such as income and gender, and actually like that could be explored more. And we find that usually like higher income respondent and male respondent have higher pass-through that all respondent. And finally, also we show that actually higher inflation expectations seems to cause very small actions in labor market actions. Only one in particular that is basically applied to another job that is related with some evidence that show that higher inflation moments are related with higher job and job transition. And then we explore a little bit the implication of this inflationary shock into a new Keynesian model where we match our empirical facts, and we find that actually like our findings show that actually this friction on the labor on the contract, that is I think the one that we were discussing before. So it seems that people perceive their labor contract as very rigid, and because of that they perceive like inflationary shocks as a shock that is going to reduce the utility through a decrease in wages and an aggregate increase in hours in some cases. So basically higher labor and lower real wages. And then basically this try to with this kind of model we try to see what are the macroeconomic implications of this type of rigidity that we found in the empirical part, and secondly with basically to try to rationalize why people might dislike inflation. So I think that I saw something in the chat, but I cannot open it, or I don't know how to open it. So if somebody can help me with that. No?
Let me try. I don't see anything in the Q&A. The paper. Yeah. So here I see Federico, who's not able to be in a panelist. So I have two questions, Federico. How do you rationalize the large difference between the OLS and the IB results? Can your model help you in rationalizing this? And what are the policy implications of the paper?
So in terms of the OLS and the IB, yeah, I haven't think about that much about that, but there is in general like a high correlation between the answers on this question. So actually, like people have some numerical biases. So actually, when they respond 5%, usually they respond like close to 5% around that people. So usually you have some respondent that respond like kind of like like 20% to everything in general. So maybe that is coming from when we take only the variation from that coming from the treatment that kind of like changes the coefficient a little bit, but we haven't explored that much, and that's something that we should look at. So thank you. And in terms of the policy implications, so at least that the one from what I have been exploring before, so there was kind of this idea before the events that we have now, that that was that basically maybe we can have some type of forward guidance that instead of going through the interest rate, can go to the inflation rate. So so basically saying that, okay, we're going to communicate that inflation is going to be high in the future. People are going to receive a lower real interest rate, and because of that, basically we're going to increase consumption today. I think that comes generally from a model where, again, like the only rigid contract is kind of the borrowing contract, and when we add basically this kind of rigid labor market, and rigid, the result can be different. And in particular, basically, this helps us to rationalize why basically people dislike inflation. And then the second question is like, if we come from a world of actually low inflation, so very rigid nominal contracts, then when we move a high inflation scenarios as today's scenario, then actually like this could basically add another cost of inflation, at least like another cost of unexpected inflation on consumers, because actually like it seems that consumers don't perceive to have many tools to address basically this reduction in real wages coming from higher prices. So I would say that those are kind of like the policy implication for that would be maybe like stronger action in inflation as well. You guys have been doing in Chile, but yeah, like maybe that's something that should be could be discussed more openly, like when we see like these increases in inflation in the data.
Hi, I have a question. Miguel Fuentes from the Central Bank of Chile. I don't know, are you hearing me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Regarding the policy implications, I want to follow up on Federico's question. One of the debates now in the US, given the current macro situation, is that high inflation in itself is going to lead consumers to spend less. People are probably reading a lot about how inflation is in the highest level in the past 40 years. I wonder what your paper says on your results about how strong is that channel that people and one of the people have called this the immaculate disinflation, that inflation is going to come down because the Fed does not have to do much in terms of rates, because expenditure is going to come down because people are going to feel the inflation by itself, and they're going to be more cautious, feel poorer, and spend less, and everything's going to be okay. So what do your paper says about that way of reasoning? Thank you.
So yeah, so I guess what you're saying like is kind of like this is speaking to the self-correcting mechanism of inflation. Basically, we have high inflation, and that is going to affect negatively. So basically, it's going to put some cost, and then demand is going to go down, and that's going to reduce by itself inflation. So I think it might be something like that here. So if people basically very pessimistic about the economy because of inflation, because again, like they perceive that the future real income is not going to be as big, then we can have like some reaction in terms of spending in consumption goods and all of that. So if that's the case, this can kind of rationalize a little bit that self-correcting mechanism of inflation, that I don't think that there is a lot of people talk about that one, but there is not a lot of actual evidence of what would be that self-correcting mechanism of inflation. So this could kind of shed light a little bit of that. I don't know if the implication of that is do nothing, because maybe it might be super costly in terms of welfare, and that's something that actually maybe we could explore more in this scenario. But yeah, this paper a little bit, I think that it could speak a little bit about that self-correcting mechanism in this case. In the case of inflation, I don't think that it implies that the Fed should do nothing because eventually everything is going to adjust. This might be very costly for consumers, and also we should expect that people are going to react to this inflationary shock if they are very, very permanent. So probably they're going to negotiate their contracts in a different way. We're going to start to see some indexation in the economy and all of that. So we know from emerging economies that when we have longer period of inflation, the economy, the institution of the economy react, and we see that actually like we can create kind of like this more indexed economy and then like having inflation environment. So I wouldn't say that probably do nothing is the actual solution to this problem.
Okay, I have a further question. So, so about the policy implications and the information, what you just said about this forward guidance of inflation, for them to see more accurately what inflation is. One of the results that is in the literature is that so households in general know so little that even saying the inflation target of the central bank is enough for them to give for information. So it's very effective. Just to repeat it, so in your results, do you see can you tell what kind of information is more effective?
So yeah, so what we find actually given the target of the Fed is not very effective in moving people's inflation expectations. It might come. So I would say probably a lot of people don't understand very well as well what is the role of the Fed or something like that. So I think that it might be coming from there. It seems that actually forecasts from external sources or past inflation seems to influence more inflation expectations. And again, that's a little bit of the idea again. If we go back to the world where basically information we want to do some forward guidance about inflation. So there is this work, actually it's a little bit on my paper with Koelian, Gornichenko, and Kumar, that basically it seems that very in general communication from the Fed first is high. Nobody listens to it because it's kind of we're gonna have an announcement in a couple of hours, but probably it's gonna be in very specialized news, but the rest of the news I'm not gonna get there. It's very complex. A lot of people don't understand exactly the role of the monetary authority. So all of that makes that I think that the efforts of communication usually do not reach common or common consumers, and actually that could be something that might damage the effect of basically of the policy of the Federal Reserve. So for example, now we have that there is a strong communication strategy from the monetary authorities across the world that try to actually to signal that they want to reduce inflation and they're gonna make actions to reduce inflation. But when you look at the news, most of the people are talking about the oil price, stuff like that, at least in the US. It doesn't seem that there is a translation from that complex communication that the Fed does or the ECB does to consumers. And one example of that is if we give them a target of the Fed, it moved their expectations a little bit, but just very little. It seems that the prices are very strong when we have those type of information treatment. So I would say that there is a whole other literature of basically how to communicate, and the information treatment that we give here actually might shed light a little bit of how to communicate these facts, and of course it also implies that if we want to do communication to regular people, also probably the monetary authorities should also take another step on try to reach them more actively instead of the communication strategy that most of the monetary authorities in the world have had.
Okay, and one final question from me at least is that so you showed that people with high income or male did a higher review of their income expectations, right? Of the revision. So would you be able to see whether it's because the male population in your sample has higher income?
No. So our sample is kind of is representative of the US economy. So people having higher than 100K are usually not that many. When we do the word regression, we kind of wait for that. So basically what you're asking is why basically if the result that we're finding is coming from people with very high income or
and not because they're male or the other way around,
So the middle income group also has a relatively high percent. So I think that it's a big difference between the kind of high income group relative to the one single low income group. Unfortunately, we don't have the actual income of the people. We have only those beans, so we cannot kind of explore that much more interactions. But So I don't like to say that actually the low income group has a zero pass-through because it's most about the significance, but it seems that the result is coming from male respondents and high income respondents. That's something that it seems that the main result is coming from them. With the caveat that we cannot say that necessarily that the others, the coefficient of the other is zero, but it's way closer to zero than the other. Yeah. Actually, I tried to do like the labor market actions for different demographic. For most of them, there is not like kind of a monotonic move, but if I remember correctly, I think that also higher income respondents tend to answer positively, like to the ask for a raise question, and it's significant. But I don't remember exactly the result. But it seems that they perceive their contracts as more flexible, or that they have something else to say when they face this higher inflation.
Okay, thank you. So is there any other questions?
Hi, Mathieu, can I ask one last question? Does your model have anything to say about fact number 2? Are you thinking about it? Following up with Mariana's question.
So yeah, we thought about that. So maybe we can have like two different consumers that have different market power. So basically how we thought about, so first, like it doesn't have something now. We could find something that maybe they have like a higher like negotiation. Basically, if higher income, for example, or being a male versus a female, that translates to higher bargaining power in the last bargaining part. Maybe that can kind of explain the difference in the pass-through. We haven't looked at that. So we think that the paper is mainly like empirical in a sense. So the model will take mostly from other part. We could add like two individuals, and we can explain that. I think what we did is that we kind of like look at different level of bargaining, and we find some different results. But for now, we decided more to abstract from that one and explain the fact 1 and 3. But yeah, it could be interesting to explore it, but we haven't done it like systematically yet.
Okay, perfect. And just one more question on that fact. Does the idea that low-income, high-income people, males, females, have different consumption baskets also influence your results, in the sense that you have like the inflation measure that is personal, right? It depends on what you consume, etc.
Yeah, but we instrument that person. So the posterior question is aggregate inflation. So we took the variation on on that individual. Basically, the prior is individual, but the posterior is aggregate inflation. So it might come that maybe for some groups the aggregate inflation is less relevant. That's something that I could think more. Yeah, that's something I can think more. I don't have like a but I would say that yeah, we have to look at how the data looks, or how basically those demographics inflation rates correlate with aggregate inflation. But it could be an explanation. I think about that. That's a very good point.
Perfect.
Thanks.